This year marks the 60th anniversary of the publication of Ayn Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. We wanted to mark this anniversary by talking a little bit about this book, particularly to encourage those of you who may not have read this or may have read it a while ago to read or reread this book and talk about some of the values that it offers to people who are interested in Ayn Rand, interested in her fiction, or interested in her ideas. So, a couple of the things we're going to talk about today is how this book provides insights on applying Ayn Rand's morality to life and to some particular questions that come up when thinking about it. How it articulates the foundations, the basic principles and the justification of her moral theory, the moral theory behind her heroes in novels like Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and to see some of the ways in which parts of this book raise challenges to conventional ways of thinking and even show how people can fall into certain uh, conventional and incorrect ways of thinking about moral issues without even realizing that they're really engaging in this. So we'll talk through some of the essays, the chapters in this book that bring out some of these issues and hopefully convince some of you to read or reread this book and celebrate this anniversary by highlighting the value of what I think is a really powerful book, a really powerful collection of writing. So I'm Sam Weaver, Associate Fellow at the Ayn Rand Institute. This is New Ideal, the podcast of the Ayn Rand Institute. And with me today is Mike Mazza, also an Associate Fellow at ARI. Hi, Mike.
Hi, Sam. So to start, let's set a little context for the book. As you said, this is the 60th anniversary, and it was published as, or it is a collection of essays elaborating on applying her philosophy. It's it was published after her major fiction work. So this is after Anthem, We the Living, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. It's not the first book published after those works of fiction. The first one was titled For the New Intellectual, but For the New Intellectual is actually a collection of excerpts from the novels with a long opening nonfiction essay. So this marks the first time she's publishing an entire book of nonfiction. Um, and it's the first in a series of these books. It's followed up a few years later by Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. So, Sam, we wanted to talk about this together because both of us, in different respects, are working on projects related to the virtue of selfishness. So I'm currently writing an article on the essay, The Objectivist Ethics, on how Rand argues for her moral philosophy. I'm preparing a talk related to that too for the Austin Objectivism Conference coming up in a few months. And Sam, you're working on a reading group related to the book, is that right?
Well, yeah, so I've done reading groups on this book in the past, and I'm currently working on some seminars that are based around some of the essays in this book. Basically, a lot of the work I've been doing with The Virtue of Selfishness has been around introducing Ayn Rand's philosophy, her nonfiction philosophical writings, to people who are relatively new to Rand's ideas and have mainly read and experienced her novels. So, a lot of people learn about Atlas Shrugged or The Fountainhead. They read it, they love the story, get really excited and inspired by characters like Howard Rourke or Dagny Taggart, and they're interested in learning more about the kind of ideas behind the heroes of these stories and the way of life that Ayn Rand is portraying in these novels. And this is a good first book for them to turn to it if you're interested in learning more, because it's where she really articulates her views on a lot of the kind of moral questions, especially the ones that have to do with if you're actually trying to live more like Howard Rourke or a Dagny Taggart, like what questions come up when you try to do that. It, a lot of the answers to those questions and the things that she has to say about them are found in this book. And so I've been using sometimes redoing reading groups on the whole book, sometimes doing like seminars on one or more of the essays, and have found it, really it answers a lot of the questions that are on these, new Ayn Rand readers' minds. It provides a lot of food for thought, and I think I've learned a lot from the experience of reading these essays with these first time readers and kind of getting a sense of how they're encountering these ideas. So yeah, that's part of the why I was so interested in talking about it today on this podcast.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about the book and especially the title essay as kind of elaborations or riffing on the novels, especially Atlas Shrugged. So it can be very, it can be indispensable to think, what would Rourke do, or what would Galt do, or Dagny, or I want to live up to the ideal I've seen in these characters. But a lot of so not every issue you might encounter in life that's dramatized in the novels um, is uh, is addressed in the novels, and some of the issues that come up in life are addressed not dramatically, but in the nonfiction, and they're also indispensable for understanding the plot and the characters of the novels. Again, especially Atlas Shrugged. So in the story, and this is a spoiler, so here's your fair warning. By the end of Atlas Shrugged, one of the major pieces of knowledge that Dagny Taggart acquires is that the villains, particularly her brother and Floyd Ferris and that crowd, uh, don't have the same motivation that she does. That is, she's under the impression for a lot of the novel that at root everyone has the same motives. They're motivated for by life, by some kind of sense of achievement, or at the very least, like acquiring material things. And she learns that none of that's true of these people, and that they have a fundamentally different motivation in life. And once she learns that, there's still the question for her, okay, there's two fundamentally different motivations in life. I, Dagny, and the strikers are motivated by life, by achievement, by values, and the looters, the villains, are not. They're motivated by something else. Um, how do we know that Dagny's right and the looters are wrong? I mean, in one sense, we know through the events of the novel, but in another sense, we have to make that explicit to ourselves. And that's what Galt's speech does at the end of the novels, and it makes explicit what are the reasons for thinking Dagny and the strikers are right. And the essays in this book, particularly the title or the major theoretical essay, the virtue or the objectives ethics, further elaborates on that case for Rand's moral philosophy. And then part of the elaboration is the application of it to different issues.
Yeah, and I think it's worth starting by talking about some of the essays in the book that address questions that come up. I think when people are thinking about Ayn Rand's moral philosophy, how it would apply in life, and I think sometimes whether or not it makes sense, whether or not they think it's true, it's right, and they would actually want to live this way. So one of the issues that definitely comes up when you're thinking about, for a lot of people, when they're thinking about Ayn Rand's philosophy is, well, she's advocating a morality of self-interest. I mean, right? The very title of the book is the virtue of selfishness, right? It's calling for you to live according to your self-interest. So, what does that mean for our relationships with other people? Like, how are we to relate to other people if we follow a morality of self-interest? And one essay I think addresses a question that comes up often in some form or other, and on which Rand has a really uh, deep and provocative answer. It's an essay called "The Conflicts of Men's Interests," and she puts conflicts in scare quotes in the title of that essay because what she actually argues is that there are no conflicts of interests among rational people. Rational people pursuing rational interests never actually experience a genuine conflict of interest between them. And the reason why I think this is an important point is if you're advocating a morality of self-interest, or if you're considering living by a morality of self-interest, one question that comes up is, well, if I'm pursuing my self-interest and everyone else around me is pursuing their self-interest, does this mean that we're at odds with one another, that we're going to be in conflict, and that by pursuing my interests, I have to frustrate somebody else's pursuit of their interests? And do I need to be afraid that if other people pursuing their interests, they're going to harm me in some way, or stifle my ability to achieve my interests? And so she has this essay that's called "The Conflicts of Men's Interests," where she addresses this point and kind of takes up a example where it seems quite plausible that there is a conflict of interest. Like if two people are both competing for the same job and only one person can get the job, doesn't it seem like there's a conflict of interest between those two people? And I think this is one of the it's a really powerful example of how in Rand's writing, it's really clear and also really sophisticated. Like there is a really sophisticated philosophical perspective that she's conveying, that she's arguing for, trying to convince you to adopt in this essay. But it's also, I think, really clear, like, what is her answer to this question? And it's that you need to think about your interests, not just in terms of whether you want something or whether it would be nice to have this particular thing out of context, without thinking about the kind of the surrounding set of issues, these circumstances that make it possible, the consequences of getting that thing. And she brings all of these kind of points that people may not think about when you just think, well, I should pursue my interests. What are my interests in this situation? To this kind of two people competing for the same job example, context about what kind of economic system actually makes it possible for that job to exist. The fact that it's important for the employer to be able to to have multiple applicants and be able to choose the best person for the job, that nobody owes you a job, that the employer has their own interest, and it's not that you're simply owed a job by that employer, that you exist in a broader context where there's not just one job and that's your only opportunity, that actually the goals in your life, the things that you want to achieve in your life, you need to produce through work and through trade with other people. And that if you create value, if you keep working there, there are other opportunities. It's not this one person owes you a job and that's it. So this is I think, a really deep, sophisticated essay that addresses an issue that's simultaneously like really practical to people. Like, how should I think about my relationship with another person where we're both after the same thing? And also like gets to the heart of thinking about like, what does it really mean to adopt a morality based on rational self-interest? Mike, do you have thoughts about this essay?
Yeah, so that's it's an interesting elaboration on some of one of the major themes in the lead essay, The Objectivist Ethics. So in that essay, she argues that value is the product of a creative mental act. So it's something's valuable to you only if you see it in its relationship to your life as a whole, and you see it as life promoting, and you choose it. So there's a couple of elements there. It's has to be judged by you according to a rational standard as something that's good for your life, and that you choose it. And then if you think about that in the context of, to just follow from your example of the two people competing for the same job, in the context of trade, like if you think about, when is a trade good for me? Well, it's not just good for me because I get some cash out of it or something. I mean, that's part of why it's good, is you get something in return for what you offer. But what makes trade good in a specific concrete trade, and then like in the abstract, is that it's two people doing that same process. That is, two people exercising their rational judgment about their own good. And that's when it's in that context when trade and exchange and interaction with others is to your advantage. And in the kind of conventional way of thinking about trade, like that's absent from the trade. It's just I have eggs and you have dollars, and I want dollars and you want eggs, and there's nothing more to it. Like, is it good for me to want eggs? Is it, are you selling me something that's bad for me and you know it's bad for me? Do you care? Like those questions are absent in conventional ways of thinking about it. And she brings the kind of theoretical, deep perspective from the lead essay to bear on a very like day to day, like ordinary life question of, yeah, sometimes I feel like I'm in conflict with other people. They want the same thing. And well, but part of thinking that through is is keeping this larger context that the title or the lead essay of the book um, defends and elaborates.
So one other essay I wanted to mention under this heading of like essays that give really interesting guidance is one that is answering I think a question that she got from a reader of her newsletter, and probably from more than one reader, because I've heard this question a lot from people who've read and been inspired by Ayn Rand's novels. The question is, how does one lead a rational life in an irrational society? So that's very relevant to the story of Atlas Shrugged. And it's, I think a lot of people who read that novel and see something that they relate to about it in that they're inspired by and want to be like the heroic characters, but also see parallels between some of the bad trends that occur in the society in Atlas Shrugged and trends that they see in their own society. That they see like that people around them, a lot of them are irrational. There's bad political trends. Like it seems like things aren't going well in the society around them. And that there's, I think, a question that a lot of people, readers have of, well, what should I do? It'd be great if I lived in in Galt's Gulch around all of these really rational, really productive, really capable people, but I don't live around those people today. And I feel like sometimes it's just I'm surrounded by irrationality. What should I do? And Ayn Rand she says there's a bunch of things one could say about this, but she's going to limit herself in this essay to one major piece of advice, which I think is sometimes it's not what everyone expects, I think, when they read this title. But the piece of advice is that you should never refrain from passing moral judgment, that you should be committed to judging morally the people and the events that you see around you. And I think sometimes this is taken to mean that she's advocating that you go around like condemning and praising everything like vocally and like expressing your views to other people all the time. Even though she says in the essay that's not really what she's the main thing she's advocating. I mean, there are cases where one should pronounce moral judgment vocally and make one's judgment known to others. And she talks about that in that essay. But I think that the major reason why this is important, uh, and what she argues for here, is that uh, it passing moral judgment within your mind, making clear your own evaluation, your own view of the people and events around you, is important to maintain your own mind and to maintain the clarity of your own judgment when you're surrounded with people whose judgment you may not respect and who are promoting all sorts of irrational ideas, irrational judgments. That it's important for you not to sort of give into this. Well, maybe they all mean well. Who am I to really judge this? It's this kind of agnosticism that people can fall into, and that this is a really um, that she thinks this is how you sort of lose uh, control of like your own mind and your own integrity and your own kind of rational clarity. And I think this is a I think this is a powerful perspective to some of the students that I've talked to about this essay, and that this is not something they expect, and it takes some time to kind of wrap your head around what exactly does she mean by this. It's not, necessarily always go and argue with your professor and do things like that, but there's something more personal, and there's something that has more to do with your own mind and having a clear perspective on what's going on in your society, that this essay illuminates.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite Rand essays, and I think the point you made at the end of what you said, Sam, about it's important to do this to keep your integrity and your own rational clarity. I mean, it's important to do this to keep your own self-esteem. It's the easiest thing in the world to become morally intimidated, especially when the whole culture is telling you, telling you what you yourself are bad, or what you're doing is immoral or evil. And it's important to not let yourself be intimidated or make excuses for things you're doing that are morally good. Um, just the other week, uh, our colleague Tristan Delige and I did a podcast on the space entrepreneurship, and my perspective on all of that, like that whole industry, is what most of these people are doing is heroic, good, virtuous, like more and morally so. And it could be really easy in that if you're one of the people, one of the people leading this charge, to, you have that perspective, but then you see all these articles, oh, the billionaire space race, and this is just the kind of uh, frivolity these people are doing, and then to justify it by conceding moral premises that you might not accept, or you might be intimidated into accepting by saying, oh, well, no, this is good because, like, think about how much it'll help the poor or the worse off in the long term, and like, no, that's not why it's good. But it's easy to be intimidated into taking that kind of perspective to sort of appease people that really, at the end of the day, as the question kind of implies, you think are irrational. I think this is just a really great kind of self-preservation, self-protection essay, especially, as um, the you find yourself at odds with the morality of the culture at large. So
Yeah.
do we want to shift to talking about the first two, like the major meat of the book is the introduction and the first essay, the objective ethics. Sam, I think you wanted to say something about the introduction.
Yeah, well, so I'll just say the reason why I wanted to talk about some of those other essays and the kind of more specific questions first is because I think that those are the kind of questions that are like, you can encounter them in your own life, and like, what do I do when I'm dealing with irrationality in people all around me? How should I think about my relationships with other people? How should I think about conflicts or apparent conflicts of interest? And there are other essays that do that sort of thing in the book. Those are the kind of issues that I think one will encounter concretely in scenarios in one's life, if you're trying to think about how to apply the moral perspective from Ayn Rand's novels. But I think once you start really thinking about those questions and the answers that she gives to those questions, all roads lead back to that first essay in the book, The Objectivist Ethics. And I've experienced this with students sometimes, where we'll be reading one of these other essays and talking about the perspective that she's giving, and it comes down to, she's talking about, you need to define your interests rationally and according to an appropriate standard of value. Well, what is that standard and how does she justify it? That's in the objectivist ethics. You should morally judge the people that you encounter and the events that occur in your society. According to what standard should you pass moral judgment? That answer is in the objectivist ethics. So that's, I think, it can seem like a very abstract and theoretical essay. And we'll get into it, I think, a bit of in a minute, of what kind of the highlights are and the power of that essay. But I think when you start thinking about these concrete questions, or these more questions that people will encounter just going through life, they lead back to the foundational essay the objectivist ethics. And then, yes, also that introduction to the book, which this is the introduction to the virtue of selfishness, I think is actually a, a really great essay in its own right. And so sometimes if you're reading a book, you might be tempted to skip the introduction and go ahead and get to chapter one. I would highly encourage you not to do that in the case
Mhm.
of the virtue of selfishness, because the introduction is a really powerful piece of writing in its own right. And I think a big part of what she's trying to do in that introduction is explain why it matters that she's using the word selfishness to describe her morality and is using it as a positive description, using it as a good thing. And I think this is something, this is something that came up with people and comes up still today with people who are familiar, start to learn about her moral perspective, but have the kind of view, well, but selfishness, that's not, you don't mean by selfishness what most people mean. And isn't it kind of just confusing that you're using this term selfishness? And wouldn't it be easier to just use a different, coin your own term or say something else to capture what you mean? And what she has to say in the introduction is that it's not just about the word, it's about the way that people think about your interests and the people's self-interest and what it means for someone to be pursuing their own interests. Because the conventional usage of that word selfishness, it is used in a way that she calls a package deal. It's where it's putting together things, putting together specific things that are labeled under that word that are actually fundamentally different in really important ways, and encourages you to blend them together and treat them as the same in ways that you shouldn't. And
Mhm.
so in the case of this word selfishness, it's a criminal and a businessman are put together under this term because they're both, in a sense, they're after their own interests. The criminal goes around and robs people to take their money, or the warlord goes around and conquers countries and takes their gold and their resources. And a businessman goes into business, buys and sells things in order to make money and increase his own wealth. And so there's like this superficial similarity that people are using to group them together, but there's she argues, a much deeper difference. There's much deeper differences between these two. That there's a huge difference between producing by using your mind to create values, to trade them on a voluntary basis with other people in mutually beneficial transactions, to actually try to understand the world and figure out how to make products and services that improve human life, versus the criminal or the warlord who just goes around using force on other people to force them to submit and to serve him. He's not trying to understand the world, not trying to be productive. He's just taking things by force from people who are productive. And these are very different things. And if you think of them as, these are both selfishness, these are both selfish people, you're missing really, really crucial moral differences. And so she is using this term, I think, to reclaim it and to break up that package deal that people have, and to urge people to think about morality in a really different way. Uh, and Mike, do you want to say more about what that really different way is?
Yeah, so in the introduction, she defends the concept of selfishness and the use of the term. But one thing that she says that I think is really interesting and easy to miss, but very important, is that she points out that the question of egoism or altruism, or the way she puts it is the beneficiary of your actions. Like, who should really benefit from my actions? Should it be who should morally benefit? Like myself, someone else, God, or what? That's a midstream question. That's some kind of, that's a question you ask after you're already well into the subject of ethics. And it's part of why she thinks that the subtitle of the book is A New Concept of Egoism. So it's the virtue of selfishness, a new concept of egoism. And her view is that, yeah, I have a whole new conception of not just egoism or self-interest. I have a whole new conception of what morality is, what it's for, what it is as a subject matter. And she says that the way to understand um, morality and egoism's place in it is that you have to realize that when you properly understand the subject of morality and what the purpose of having a morality is, you'll see that egoism in the proper understanding kind of just um, a straightforward consequence of that is when you really understand why we need morality, why we need such a subject matter, you'll see that yeah, there kind of couldn't be any other moral code than an egoistic one. And the way she understands that is, well, it's a concept of egoism or of an egoistic morality in which the whole point of morality is to help you think about what kind of life you want and how to choose it and make it happen and how to integrate all the different uh, smaller values that together make up a life, how to integrate all that into a whole. So she starts her first essay in the book, The Objective is Ethics, by asking a series of why questions about um, what morality is for and how we know it. And she makes the case that in order to answer those sort of questions, what is morality? Why do we need it? How do we justify one moral code over another? You'll get down to questions about what is value and do we need value? Why do we need value? Value, as she understands it, is just the objects of our actions. So big and small things. So um, Dagny Taggart values Hank Rearden, her love for Hank Rearden, her love for the John Galt line, and the sandwich she has for lunch, and her integrity. Like all these kind of things she acts to pursue in the course of the novel to preserve, pursue, strengthen. And a moral code, as Rand understands it, is a set of or a theory or a set of principles for determining what is in and what is out of those kind of things that I pursue. Yeah, I pursue a lot of things. Maybe I should pursue this one more. Maybe I shouldn't pursue that one at all. That's what a moral code helps you do. And the way she approaches ethics in that essay is just as radically new as the actual moral code she advocates. So we were making a big deal earlier about selfishness and who says that it's virtuous to be selfish other than Ayn Rand, and that's really striking. But what's also striking about about the essay, and it's also in Galt's speech to an extent, is how she makes her case for egoism. And it's through a series of step-by-step causal arguments about what is morality? Well, why do we need it? That is, what makes it necessary? What does it mean to for a morality to be necessary? Well, moralities are codes of values, and if codes of values are necessary, then we must need values. If we need codes, must need the values. How do we determine whether or not values are necessary? And no other philosopher thinks that way about values, value theory, morality. They all kind of start, yeah, people pursue values, so let's determine which ones they should pursue. So should they pursue altruistic ones, egoistic ones? She says, no, like what's the basis or what's the causal basis for value as such, for there being such a thing as value? And that gets into her whole argument that value and the standard of value is based in the requirements of life, of human life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and that's where it's you becomes really apparent what the value and how this perspective clarifies things for anybody. I mean, there's issues in here that are of interest to philosophers, but the perspective here, I think, is one that's valuable to anybody who wants to live, who cares about their life and living the best life possible. Is that it's where she ends up, what she argues for in this essay, and then goes on to spell out some of like how this actually applies and the principles that this involves is that the standard is what is required for human life. Like that's the standard in morality, and that's the kind of thinking that a proper morality on her perspective would involve a person doing. It involves thinking about what sort of actions, what sort of values, what sort of uh, qualities of character do I need to pursue, to go after, to
To
try
live. Yeah.
to craft in myself in order to live successfully, in order to actually sustain and enhance my life. And that's a like I think there can be a question of, morality is this thing that says you should do this, you should do that. But and she makes this point near the beginning of the essay, like, do we really need such a thing as a code of morality? And this answer, I think, makes quite clear why you do need it. Is if it's a guide to successful living, if it's a guide to what to do if you want to actually live, that is a really powerful reason why anyone needs morality, and why this would be relevant. This essay is relevant not just to philosophers and intellectuals, but to all human beings who value their own lives.
Just one final thought on that that essay. Part of what's so interesting about it is that she gives us in that essay a framework from which you can think about, judge, and even criticize what she says in the rest of the book. So the idea is that the standard of morality that she's arguing for, that she's proved in the Objectivist Ethics, the first essay, um, is that for any choice you make, any value you pursue, it's good only if it integrates with the sum total of your life, and that life as a whole is a a self-maintaining, self-standing standing life. It's not a parasitical and something else, or exploitative. Uh, and then if you have that as a standard and you think, well, um, uh, doesn't life require compromise, which is the title of one of the other essays in the book, you have a formula, a kind of basic formula for answering that question. It is, well, what is human life and what are its requirements? And if human life requires compromise, then compromise is good. But if it doesn't, if it requires principle, then that gives you a different answer. Compromise is not good. It's evil. It's bad. It's self-destructive. And you could go through the whole litany of virtues she advocates in that essay, justice and integrity, etc. And it's, what's the justification for living a just life, or what's the proof that a just life is morally proper? Well, it's that it's going to be a life it's necessary for human life that we each practice this virtue of justice. Um, so with that said, why don't we look at some of the other essays she has in the collection? Particularly, I think we want to look at some of the ones that um, discuss conventional but misleading ways of thinking. And I mentioned, doesn't life require compromise?
Yeah, so something that I hope we've brought out already is that part of what Ayn Rand is doing that I think is so valuable and so clarifying is that uh, she challenges various conventional ways of thinking that people take for granted, and sometimes just are informing the way that you break up the world, or the way that you classify things and the way that you sort of could think about like the alternatives in front of you, uh, that you might not even realize are operative in your own thinking. She doesn't take any of these things for granted. And uh, like when there's something that she thinks like this is confusing people, it's you're putting things together that don't belong together, like with the conventional meaning of selfishness, or you're presenting two things as an alternative that aren't, that's not an exhaustive set of alternatives. Like she'll do that with the idea that the alternatives are either to sacrifice yourself for the well-being of others or to sacrifice other people for your own well-being. Like that's not exhaustive. There's neither sacrificing yourself nor other people. Um, she does this like throughout the book in all sorts of ways. Sometimes it's, if you haven't read this book in a while, but you've read it before, and then you go back and just read through these essays, I think you'll probably be surprised at how many times there's something going on where she questions the question or questions the way people are using a term, and challenges a kind of conventional way of thinking. So you mentioned that doesn't life require compromise essay, and this is one I think where she's doing just that, is because there's that question. So you mentioned like the issue of you can evaluate whether or not life requires compromise based on what compromise actually does in your life and what life's requirements are and how it relates to them. And yeah, that's an important aspect of what she does in that essay. Another aspect of what she does that I think is really useful is she brings our focus to this term compromise and looks at like, what do people mean by this? Is this term actually describing one category of things, that it's either yes, life requires these things, or no, it doesn't? Or do people sometimes use this term in a way that it then kind of packages together things that are importantly different and shouldn't just be treated as one big lump that goes together? And that's what she brings out in this essay, is like that when people are talking about compromise, they're talking about essentially two different types of thing, two different types of agreement that one might make with another person. One of which is the sort of compromise that one might make with a street vendor who you're haggling over how much to pay for a piece of fruit, and he wants you to pay $5 and you want to pay $1, and you haggle and agree on 250. That there's that kind of compromise where you're agreed on having some sort of exchange of money for fruit that is mutually agreed upon between the two of you. But what you disagree on is the exact amount involved, and you end up meeting in the middle between two amounts on an amount that is agreeable to both of you. Like that type of thing, where you agree on, the way she puts it is like you agree on a basic principle, and what you're deciding is how exactly to implement that principle. You agree on the principle of fruit for money. You're reaching a compromise on the particular implementation, how much money for how much fruit. Then, on the other hand, there's the kind of compromise that people are often trying to encourage you to accept by asking this kind of doesn't life require compromise question, which is a compromise on basic principles. In other words, the kind of view that is behind like the mixed economy, the idea that, well, we don't need to be completely in favor of economic freedom, but we also don't need to be completely in favor of controls, government power, central planning. We can do something that's in the middle. And can't you just accept as a compromise a few controls and some freedom, some controls? And like, isn't that the sort of compromise that uh, would be just like the fruit vendor kind of compromise, where yeah, you live in a society with other people, they have different opinions from you, you have to sometimes just agree to meet in the middle, like you did with the fruit vendor. And her argument is that that is not the same thing. That is a disagreement on principles between the people who are in favor of freedom and the people who are in favor of controls. And meeting in the middle in that case means giving up the principle. It means giving up the principle that people have a right to make their own decisions in life, to decide who to trade with, how much to produce, who to interact with. It's a total concession on that principle. And she compares it, to make it more stark, to the idea that a burglar comes to your house and you agree to a compromise where you'll let him take some of your property, but not everything. It's like, well, by giving him one single thing, you've conceded the idea, you've given up the principle that your property is your own and that he has no right to come in and rob you. So these are both things that people often will refer to as a compromise. The Republicans and Democrats have reached a compromise on this, or can't you compromise on your free market principles a little bit? And the people haggling with the street merchant, and like, she's identifying there are important differences here that you're disregarding if you group them all together under compromise. And her answer then is, life often does involve the one kind of compromise, the kind of compromise on the concretes, the compromise with the street vendor, or the compromise with your friends on what restaurant to go to on Thursday night. But it doesn't require, and in fact, you should avoid, because it's destructive to your life, the kind of compromise where you give up fundamental principles.
One of my favorite essays from the book that does this sort of thing is the essay Collectivized Ethics. Um, and what she part of what she's doing in that essay, so she raises the question that's often raised in a maybe more of a political context about capitalism. Um, People ask her, oh, what about the poor? Like, what about the starving, the weak, etc. And there's her answer to that is not to just take the question as is, but to challenge some premises behind the question, which, I mean, just that much, that questions can have premises, I think some people often find surprising, uh, but they do. And in this case, what will be done about the poor? Well, it's if you phrase it that way, it elides that, well, what will be by who? Who will do what and for what reason? And she's challenging the kind of, so part of the premise behind the question, there's a collectivist premise that is, we must do things for as a group, as a whole. And then she's challenging also an altruist premise behind it, that is that if you drop the collectivism, well, what should I do about the poor? Like that, there's some obligation here and if you're advocating some, if you're at whatever moral theory you're advocating or political theory you're advocating, you need to grapple with the question. There's people worse off than me that I have to take into account in my moral point of view. And she's saying no, that like I'm an egoist. That is not part of my view of what morality is. That it's by its nature other regarding. So just to see her go through and like pull out that assumption out of the question, I think is in and of itself worth reading. But then she'll go on and challenge those premises too. It's not just that she's showing that they have premises; she's challenging them. And this is a good essay to read together with the last essay in the book. I think it's the last essay in the book, The Argument from Intimidation. And the argument from intimidation uh, is a kind of way of arguing that she's, I actually don't know if it's original to her, but I think it's original to her, is this kind of argument that goes like this. Well, uh, an enlightened person knows that we are obligated towards the poor. So related to an ad hominem, that is, it's trying to intimidate you, scare you out of asking certain questions. And in the essay, the argument from intimidation, it's more of a political context. Like, don't you know that capitalism has been refuted? And like, just raising that question is supposed to get you to shut up. Um, but it's wider than just a political intimidation. You could think of this as a moral intimidation, too. What about the poor? And you're supposed to be like, oh yeah, I need to account for the poor in my new ethics. Like or well, why do I? I mean, that's part of what she's doing in kind of a new concept of um, egoism, a new concept of morality is, yeah, it's not baked into morality that the good is primary concern with other people, regardless of who they are or how they're related to me. Um, and I think a lot of um, a lot of objections to uh, her new way of thinking are just kind of arguments from intimidation. Like, don't you care about the poor? And what, you're just gonna be concerned with your own self-interest while there's starving people on the other side of the world? And like that's the whole it's just this kind of question that you're supposed to feel uncomfortable about. Um, so I think those two essays together are really good at both helping understand her perspective, and if you agree with her perspective, understand how to execute on it consistently, and then also to help you identify uh, what's going on. We started earlier talking about how does one lead a rational life in an irrational society, and part of that pronouncing moral judgment is resisting kind of attempts to intimidate you when you don't agree with the premise behind the question used to intimidate you.
Yeah, and I think this is some this type of uh, response that she has of encouraging you to rethink the question and not just sort of accept the perspectives that are being kind of the conventional perspectives that are being thrown at you in certain questions that people are trying to get you to accept. Like, I think this is something at least that I found really valuable when I was first uh, like the first several years of studying Ayn Rand's ideas and like then getting into conversations or arguments with people, and like this kind of thing would come up. And I think if you haven't thought about and sort of really accepted and built into your thinking the idea that you sometimes need to question the question. Sometimes you need to,
Mhm.
like, well, what is the premise behind this question? Is this something that is true? Is this something that I should just accept and or is it something that I should challenge? I think if you don't have that built in, at least my experience was, you get hit with one of these questions like, what will be done about the poor? What should society do about the poor? Is like, oh, I'm on the defensive. I need to. I know that there's something. I don't agree with like the welfare state or anything like that, but everyone cares about this, and this is the question is what will be done about them. So I'm like on the defensive. I'm
Yeah, I need an
uncomfortable.
answer. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's realizing that there's something behind that question that is, well, what is this society, or what is this idea that there's like a we that does things as one unit and has these certain obligations to, like, I need to challenge that. And that, not just for arguing with other people but for my own thinking, is was really valuable to like get that insight and just reframe how I was thinking about, like, this is now not a question that's just, oh yeah, this is a real challenge and I don't know how to answer this. I don't know how to answer it in my own thinking.
I think before we go, just we can mention two more essays at the end, I think, and just to mention them as to give the audience a sense of um, the breadth of the book too. She has a few social political essays at the end, towards the end of the book, that kind of show you in practice like what are the political social conditions that her moral philosophy implies. So one essay is Man's Rights, in which she defends a politics based on individual rights. Think the founding fathers, sort of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. But she explains how that conception of politics really rests on an egoist basis. Uh, Even if people who in the past who've advocated that politics haven't recognized that it rests on an egoistic basis, she's arguing that it does, and that by making that basis explicit, we'll be better able to defend it. And the other essay that I think is worth pointing out is her essay on racism. Um, she identifies racism as a form of collectivism, and it's interesting not just for the actual view she advocates, but like how she arrives at the view. And she's got this perspective on racism that really we're used to thinking of racism as just about skin color. Um, but she points out that that's really kind of part of a wider phenomenon, which is thinking about and judging people based on lineage or heritage. So she thinks of like aristocracy as a form of racism, like you're from good stock. And she interrelates familiar American style racism to this kind of broader phenomenon, European racism, and that I find that essay really, really valuable as well.
Yeah, something about one more point about both of those essays, I think, is that in both of them, she's taking up concepts that are very familiar to people in contemporary political discourse. The term rights, the term racism. These words come up all the time in political discussions, but I think a lot of people, especially with rights, but racism too, a lot of people use those terms without having any clear idea of what they mean by them, and without a defensible notion of why they think those exist, what they think the implication of those are, like what rights do people have, what is and what isn't a right. I think most people who use the word rights could not give a very coherent explanation of why they think we have rights A, B, and C, but not rights X, Y, and Z. And
Mhm.
in both of these essays, I think she's bringing a lot of clarity and bringing a distinctive view of why do we need this term? What does this term actually describe? Like what does it help us understand about the world, about events, about politics, about people? And how do we like what belongs in and what doesn't belong in? And that's some discussion. Uh, there's a lot of discussion around that with racism in recent years and also with rights, but I think there's not a lot of clarity in many conventional discussions of those terms. And so when approaching these essays, I think it's worth making sure that you don't import the conventional perspective that of how you hear people use these words normally, and pay careful attention to what she says. Here's my definition of this, and here's why I think this is the right way to understand this, and here's the observations that lead to forming this concept and making it a useful term, because it's not in either of those cases the the things that most people that you hear today mean by those terms. All right, Mike, any final thoughts before we
I
end
think
the
we should wrap
podcast?
up. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope that if you haven't read the book in a while, or if you haven't read it at all, that we've given you some encouragement to take a look at The Virtue of Selfishness. And we usually do resources at the end of the podcast. I think for obvious reasons, we have just one today to recommend to you, The Virtue of Selfishness, which was published now 60 years ago. I really encourage you again to read or reread this book for all the reasons that we've already talked about today. Finally, if you enjoyed the podcast today, we'd appreciate it if you subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell to get notifications for when we go live or post new recordings. That way, you'll see all of our content when it comes out. And if you're watching this on YouTube, we'd also appreciate if you would like or comment or share the episode or do all of those things. It really helps us with the algorithm to attract new viewers. So if you thought that this was valuable, we appreciate you helping out with that. And of course, if you're on other platforms such as Facebook, please consider doing the same. Also, if you have any questions or feedback, comments about today's episode, or if you have ideas for topics that you would like to hear us discuss on the podcast in the future, you can reach out to us by email at newideal@aynrand.org. We read all of your messages. We reply to many of them and sometimes take them into consideration when we're deciding what topics to cover on the podcast. All right. Thanks, everyone, for watching the podcast. And thanks, Mike, for talking about this book with me today.
Thanks, Sam.